Hello, my dear friends. Welcome to Hauntra. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and press the bell icon so that you don't miss any exciting coming up videos. It was the last New Year's Eve Sam would ever host. The small, remote mountain cabin was tucked away from the world, surrounded by thick trees and the promise of a white, snow-covered night. Sam, ever the host, had made sure every detail was perfect. The decorations were carefully placed, the food was prepared in abundance, and the drinks were ready to flow. His friends were arriving one by one, eager to celebrate the end of a challenging year and the hopeful beginning of another. As the evening progressed, the living room filled with the sound of laughter, clinking glasses, and music playing in the background. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, but something felt off to Sam. Perhaps it was the heavy snowstorm outside, blocking the cabin from the outside world. It was hard to even see the driveway through the thick white veil, but Sam couldn't shake the odd sense that the night wasn't going to go as planned. Among the 10 people Sam had invited, there was one person he didn't recognize. A tall, pale man with sharp, angular features stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames. His clothes were dark, formal even, but there was something odd about his demeanor. He never seemed to move, to interact with anyone. His cold, dark eyes flickered as if absorbing the warmth of the fire, but never fully committing to the present. "Who's that guy by the fireplace?" Sam asked Rachel, his closest friend. She turned to look, but didn't seem to know him. "I don't know. Maybe he's with Sarah?" Rachel said, shrugging. Sam wasn't convinced. Sarah had assured him the night before that she hadn't brought anyone, and she was equally confused when Sam pointed the man out to her. They all assumed it was some strange mix-up, someone else's guest. But there was an uneasy tension in the air that they couldn't ignore. The man didn't speak a word to anyone, nor did he even acknowledge their presence. He just stood there, eerily still. When the clock neared midnight, Sam noticed the man had moved to the far corner of the room. How he had gotten there without anyone noticing was a mystery. The movement, though subtle, sent a chill down Sam's spine. He decided to confront the man to put his own growing discomfort to rest. "Hey," Sam began, walking toward him. The man turned slowly, meeting Sam's gaze with eyes so hollow and dark they seemed to absorb the light. There was no warmth in his expression, just a chilling vacancy. "Can I help you?" Sam asked, trying to sound casual. "I was invited," the man replied, his voice hoarse and unsettling. Sam blinked, puzzled. "By who?" The man's lips curled into a faint, almost sinister smile. "By you." A cold shiver ran down Sam's spine. He hadn't invited this man. He was certain of it. The feeling of dread crept deeper into Sam's bones, but before he could respond, the lights flickered, and suddenly, the entire cabin plunged into darkness. The guests screamed in surprise, fumbling for their phones and flashlights. The room was chaotic for a moment as they tried to regain control. When the lights returned a few minutes later, the man was gone. "Did he leave?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. Sam rushed to the door, thinking maybe the man had slipped outside, but the snowstorm still raged, and there were no footprints in the fresh snow outside. The door was locked, the windows shut. There was no sign of anyone leaving. "Where did he go?" Sam murmured to himself as the group nervously searched the cabin, calling out his name, but there was no answer. The man had simply disappeared, leaving no trace behind. As the clock struck midnight, a loud, insistent knock echoed through the cabin. Everyone froze. Sam, his heart pounding, cautiously approached the door and slowly opened it, expecting to find someone or something. But there was nothing. No one stood there. Only a single weathered object rested on the doorstep. A leather-bound journal. It seemed old, almost antique, with no label or markings. "What's this?" Sam muttered, picking it up. The others crowded around as he opened the journal. Inside, the pages were filled with strange, disturbing entries, detailed accounts of the group's lives. It was as if someone had been watching them for years. One entry read, "New Year's Eve, 11:59 p.m. The lights go out, the guest list grows by 1, the clock strikes midnight. The missing begins." Sam's stomach twisted with fear. The entries grew more cryptic as he flipped through the pages. Some entries described personal secrets only he and his friends knew. The final entry, however, left him frozen. "One of you will stay with me." The group stared at the journal in shock. Sam closed it, his mind racing. Who was this man? How did he know so much about them? The unease in the cabin grew thick, suffocating. No one spoke for a long time. The storm showed no signs of letting up, so they decided to remain in the cabin until morning. As the night wore on, the tension in the air became unbearable. Hours passed, and Sam was exhausted, but he couldn't sleep. The sound of the wind howling outside seemed to echo in his head. He felt as though he was being watched. At around 3 a.m., Sam noticed Rachel was missing. Her coat was still hanging by the door, and her phone was left on the table. Panic set in as they searched the cabin again, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. No trace. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, her voice trembling. But when they went to the front door, it was locked from the inside, and the snow outside was untouched, no footprints leading away. The situation was spiraling into something they couldn't comprehend. Rachel had vanished, leaving only the journal as a clue. The police arrived hours later, but their investigation led nowhere. No one had any answers. The only piece of evidence was the journal, which they dismissed as an elaborate prank. Sam couldn't shake the feeling, though, that something far darker was at play. Years have passed since that fateful night, but Sam has never forgotten. Every year on New Year's Eve, he locks the doors, turns off the lights, and stays hidden. He doesn't dare leave his house or venture out into the world. He never forgets the journal, the man who appeared out of nowhere, and the feeling that he was not alone. The knock on the door still echoes in his mind, and Sam knows, deep down, that something from that night is still watching him. It was supposed to be a night of celebration, a night to say goodbye to the past year and welcome in the new one with joy. But for Emma, this New Year's Eve would be the start of a nightmare that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Emma had always loved the traditions of New Year's Eve, gathering with friends, playing games, watching fireworks, and of course, the countdown to midnight. This year, however, she found herself alone. She had just moved into a new apartment in a small, quiet town that didn't seem to have much to offer in terms of social events. But she had come to enjoy the peace and simplicity. Her life, though solitary, had a sense of calm that Emma had grown to appreciate. With no plans for the evening, Emma decided to stay in. She picked up some takeout from a local restaurant and set up a cozy space in her living room, complete with her favorite movies and snacks. The TV was on in the background, and she had set her phone to alert her when the countdown to midnight began. It was going to be a quiet night, but Emma was fine with that. She had spent too many years surrounded by chaos to appreciate the stillness and quiet she now had. As the night wore on, Emma began to notice something odd. It was subtle at first. She thought it was just the quiet of the house getting to her. But then it became impossible to ignore. There was a persistent, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere in the apartment. It was faint, almost like the sound of a clock ticking, but it was offbeat, irregular. Emma tried to shake it off, but the more she listened, the more the tapping grew in intensity. She got up from the couch and moved toward the source of the sound, which seemed to be coming from the kitchen. The apartment was small, and it didn't take long for her to find the source. On the kitchen counter, an old, dusty clock that she didn't remember owning sat quietly, its hands frozen at 11:59 p.m. The rhythmic tapping was coming from the clock, as if it were counting down to something. Confused, Emma reached out to touch the clock. But as her fingers brushed against it, the sound stopped. The apartment fell silent once again. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it, but then, out of nowhere, her phone buzzed with a notification. There was a text message from an unknown number. "Are you ready for midnight?" the message read. It was short, simple, and chilling. Emma stared at the screen, wondering who had sent it. She didn't recognize the number, and there was no name attached. Just a simple, unsettling question. A strange unease crept over her, but she dismissed it as a prank. After all, it was New Year's Eve. Strangers often sent odd messages in the spirit of the holiday. But the tapping from the kitchen started again. Now it was louder, more insistent. The clock on the counter seemed to be moving on its own, its hands ticking forward slowly. Emma, her heart racing, grabbed her phone and tried to text back, but the screen froze. She tried to call a friend, but the call wouldn't go through. Her apartment, once quiet and peaceful, now felt suffocating, the air thick with tension. She heard another notification from her phone and looked down. The same unknown number had messaged her again. "The countdown is almost over." Panic set in as Emma felt her pulse quicken. She backed away from the kitchen, feeling as though the walls were closing in. The clock had started moving faster, and the tapping had grown to a maddening rhythm. 11:59 p.m. Emma looked at the clock, then at her phone. Time seemed to be standing still, but the minute hand was steadily advancing toward midnight. Suddenly, the lights in the apartment flickered. For a brief moment, everything went dark, and when the lights returned, Emma saw something that made her blood run cold. Standing in the doorway of the living room was a figure, tall, thin, and wearing a long coat. Its face was obscured, but the outline of its features was clear. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there in the dim light. Emma's heart raced as she backed away, stumbling over furniture. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her throat was dry, and her mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure didn't seem to react, just stood motionless, watching her. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The apartment was empty again, but the feeling of being watched lingered. The clock on the kitchen counter ticked louder than ever, now at 11:59 and 30 seconds. Emma's phone buzzed again. It's almost time. Her breath caught in her throat. This couldn't be happening. This was just some twisted nightmare she couldn't wake up from. But no matter how hard she tried to shake it off, it felt real. Too real. The clock's hands moved to 11:59 and 59 seconds. The tapping stopped. Emma froze, unable to move as she waited for the final moment. The silence was deafening, and then the apartment plunged into darkness once again. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Emma stood motionless, terrified, her mind racing. She didn't know whether to run, scream, or hide. The minutes dragged by, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the lights flickered back to life, and when Emma looked around, everything had changed. The apartment was no longer the same. The furniture was different, the walls were a darker shade, and the air smelled stale. It was as though the entire place had shifted, as if time itself had been altered. And there, standing in the center of the living room, was the same figure, this time closer. "Welcome to the new year," the figure said, its voice deep and distorted. Emma tried to scream, but again, no sound came out. The figure took a step toward her, and suddenly, the clock started ticking backward. The hand spun rapidly, counting down again. 11:59, 11:58, 11:57. Emma felt her body go numb as she realized something unimaginable. The countdown had never ended. She had been stuck in a loop, a twisted cycle where time never moved forward. The figure's face came into view, a horrific, featureless mask of pure darkness. It grinned. "This year," it said, "isn't over." The night of December 31st had always been one of anticipation for Natalie. A night to reflect on the year past, let go of old regrets, and embrace the promise of the new one. But this year was different. This year, something was waiting for her, something she had no way of understanding, something she couldn't escape. Natalie lived in a modest apartment in a high-rise building. It was nothing extravagant, but it was hers. The building was quiet, with only a few tenants, and while it wasn't the most luxurious, it had everything she needed. That night, as she prepared for her usual New Year's Eve routine, she noticed an unusual stillness in the air. The city outside her window was alive with the sounds of celebrations, but her apartment seemed silent, almost too silent. It was just after 9 p.m. when Natalie noticed it for the first time. She stood in front of her bathroom mirror, adjusting her makeup before heading to a small gathering with a few close friends. As she applied her lipstick, she caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of her eye. For a split second, she saw a shadow move behind her in the reflection, a tall figure that she didn't recognize. She turned quickly, but there was nothing in the room behind her. Just the empty, silent apartment. Shaking her head, she convinced herself it was just a trick of the light, a result of the exhaustion that had accumulated over the past few weeks. It had been a busy year, and she was looking forward to starting fresh in the new one. She finished her makeup and left her apartment, heading to the party. The night passed in a blur of laughter, chatter, and the clinking of glasses. By the time the countdown to midnight began, Natalie was already feeling the weight of the day catching up with her. The party was fun, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lingering just out of reach. When the clock struck midnight and fireworks lit up the sky outside, Natalie stepped out onto the balcony to take in the view. The celebration was loud, joyous, and full of energy. But in the distance, there was something strange. A figure, standing alone in the street below. It was impossible to make out any details, but it was tall, standing perfectly still, staring up at her balcony. Natalie felt a chill run down her spine. She turned away, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had come over her. But the figure stayed in her mind. It was like the shadow she had seen earlier in her bathroom mirror, unseen, yet undeniably present. When she returned to her apartment later that night, everything felt off. The quiet of the building seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. She unlocked her door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of her home greeting her. But as she walked into the hallway leading to the bathroom, she froze. The bathroom door was ajar. Natalie distinctly remembered closing it before she left. She had even checked it before leaving to make sure everything was in place. But now, it was wide open. With a deep breath, she approached the door, her heart pounding in her chest. As she stepped into the bathroom, she stopped dead in her tracks. The mirror was fogged, as if someone had just stood in front of it and breathed heavily. Her reflection was there, but something was wrong. Her image seemed slightly distorted, like it was shifting ever so slightly, as if someone else was in the mirror with her. Her stomach twisted, She stepped closer to the mirror, staring at the reflection. And that's when she saw it. The figure standing behind her, almost identical to the shadow she had seen earlier. But this time it was clear. The figure was wearing a long coat, its face obscured by darkness, its eyes staring directly at her. She turned quickly, but the bathroom was empty. The room was silent. Her breath caught in her throat. There was no one in the room with her. Yet when she looked back at the mirror, the figure was still there, standing, still, watching. Panicked, Natalie backed away from the mirror, her mind racing. She reached for her phone and tried calling her best friend, but the call wouldn't go through. She tried texting, but her phone froze. The figure in the mirror remained, unblinking, unyielding. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the apartment flickered. The figure in the mirror began to move. Slowly, it stepped forward, its shadow stretching in unnatural ways. Its hand reached out toward the mirror's surface. Natalie could feel her heart pounding in her chest, a sense of terror rising within her. She backed away, but the figure didn't stop. It kept coming closer. Her hand was shaking as she reached for the light switch, flipping it desperately. But nothing happened. The room plunged into darkness. The sound of her own breath was deafening in the silence. Her hands trembled as she tried to find the light again, her heart racing faster than it ever had before. She couldn't stop thinking about the figure that wasn't just a reflection, but something more, something that felt alive, something that had been watching her. When the lights finally flickered back on, the mirror was completely empty. The figure was gone, but the fear remained, the overwhelming sense that it was still there, waiting. She turned to leave the bathroom, but something stopped her. A message flashed across her phone screen from an unknown number. "Happy New Year, Natalie. I'll be seeing you soon." The message sent a wave of dread through her. She stared at her phone, feeling a sinking feeling in her chest. The message wasn't a prank. It couldn't be. There was no way anyone could have known what she had seen, what she had felt. The next morning, when Natalie woke up, she thought it might have been a nightmare. She was still shaken by the events of the night before, but as she got out of bed and went to the bathroom, she saw something that made her blood run cold. The mirror was fogged once again, and this time, the message wasn't from an unknown number. It was her own reflection. "Welcome to the new year," it whispered. "I've been waiting for you." Thanks for watching, and do not forget to like, share, and subscribe our channel for more new videos.